In part 2 of chapter 13, we will deal with cognitive development and look at intelligence. And in this section, we'll consider the results from two major studies. One study was conducted by John Horn, and this study comes from 1980. And based on John Horn's cross-sectional data, he showed that crystallized intelligence increases during middle adulthood. Crystallized intelligence is the accumulation of knowledge. You keep adding to your knowledge, even throughout middle adulthood. I mean, in fact, this is our crystallized intelligence is not something we really expect to decline throughout the lifespan. We keep adding to what we know. Fluid intelligence, on the other hand, is the ability to reason abstractly, basically using logic and reasoning skills. What John Horn showed with his cross-sectional data was that this ability may begin to decline in middle adulthood. And so this is kind of a graphical look at what John Horn found. According to him, crystallized intelligence continues rising throughout the lifespan. You can see that with the green line, whereas fluid intelligence steadily declines from middle adulthood onwards. And you can see it's a fairly steep decline that's certainly started by the time you're in middle adulthood. So he's saying that we're losing our logical abilities and our reasoning abilities, beginning in middle adulthood. So that was a cross-sectional study, meaning he compared different ages all at one time. There's a second study that's looking at intelligence as well, and this is the Seattle longitudinal study. This is looking at intellectual abilities throughout adulthood. Initially, this study started with 500 individuals that were tested in 1956. And since then, new waves of participants have been added to the study periodically. It is a longitudinal, ongoing study. So there was initially 500 individuals in 1956 that they continued to observe. And then once again, every so often they add new waves of participants and they continue to observe them over time. The study is still ongoing. And when we look at data from a longitudinal study, we tend to trust it more than from a cross-sectional study. So let's see what this study says about intelligence. They looked at a number of different abilities. You can see them listed here: verbal comprehension, which is basically understanding vocabulary; verbal memory, which is the ability to encode and recall meaningful language units. Meaningful language units meaning like a list of words, for instance. Can you memorize them and then recall them? Spatial orientation is being able to visualize three-dimensional objects and mentally rotate them in space. Inductive reasoning is basically logical abilities. The inductive reasoning is closest to what John Horn called fluid intelligence, reasoning ability, and we will compare those two later. Perceptual speed is the just the speed of processing of your nervous system. And one more that's not listed here that they also looked at was numeric ability. So your ability with numbers and mathematics. Okay, let's look at the results on this graph here. So it's kind of a messy graph. There's 6 different abilities that were tested. But overall, if you just kind of look at this graph over, this group of lines overall, you can see right in the middle of the graph is the age 60. And so if you look at to the left of the age 60, these lines are except for the numeric ability. I mean, the rest of them seem to be fairly flat, or in some cases even going upwards. By heading up towards 60. Certainly not a lot of decline happening. After 60, you start to see all of the abilities decline. So this is showing a later age for decline. It seems to, that the abilities are more steady during middle age. And in fact, for both men and women, peak performance was attained during middle age for 4 out of 6 abilities that they tested, intellectual abilities. The only 2 that didn't peak during middle age were numeric ability. You can see that the purple line, and perceptual speed. You know, the speed of your nervous system. Both of those showed a decline during middle adulthood years. So out of 6 abilities, only 2 were declining in middle adulthood. The speed of your processing and your numeric abilities. And the rest of them were peaking. So a very different set of results compared to what Joe Horn found with showing that we were losing reasoning and logical ability during middle adulthood. And if we compare the two, we can look at the comparison in one graph here. So the John Horn data is colored purple there from his cross-sectional approach. Once again, he was looking at reasoning ability. He called it fluid intelligence, and you can see it declining really throughout the adult lifespan. Whereas from the Seattle longitudinal study, if we look at the inductive reasoning that was tested, once again, remember that's inductive reasoning and fluid intelligence, basically same things. So we're comparing similar abilities in both these studies. And you can see from the longitudinal study that our inductive reasoning was increasing until the end of middle adulthood. And then it goes through a slow decline. Once again, if you look at that 60-year mark, that seems to be when it starts to decline. So very different outlook of your middle age years. Where as far as whether or not your reasoning ability and logical abilities are declining. Once again, we trust this green line from the longitudinal study more so than the cross-sectional results. Longitudinal studies tend to be more accurate. You're comparing people against themselves. You're watching changes that go on throughout their lives. Whereas a cross-sectional approach is open to what we call cohort effects. And this is what most likely accounted for John Horn's data. If you think about it, he published around 1980. So his 40-year-olds would have been born in 1940 when he tested them. They would have kind of grown up through the Second World War. His 60-year-olds would have been born in 1920. They would have grown up as children through the Great Depression. So it may be. So what the data suggests is that these declines that we're seeing in John Horn's data may be cohort effects. That the older the person is, the more harsh their educational opportunities were, and the more harsh the conditions of growing up were. I mean, if we look at somebody like at 25 years of age, born in 1955, and they would have been 25 when he studied them. I mean, that was a time of prosperity, and after World War II, and the 50s and 60s were just kind of a booming time, and which led to it led to the boomers, and and because it was a time where things were good in middle income America, and so cohort effects certainly could account for this decline that we see in John Horn's data. Okay, in the next section, careers, work, and leisure, I'm only going to look at the leisure section. You can read the other sections on your own. Leisure refers to pleasant times after work. Individuals are free to pursue activities and interests of their own choosing. Leisure pursuits are linked to better cognitive functioning and longer life. Okay, so in particular, what they find is that if you engage in higher complexity of work before your retirement years, it's associated with less cognitive decline, during and following your retirement. So if your work was cognitively complex and engaging, you tend to show less declines after you retire. However, what about those that had occupations with fewer cognitive challenges? Well, even for those people, so even if your work was, let's say, spent working in a factory or something similar, more hands-on work during your career, even for those people, if they start to engage in more physical and cognitive leisure activities during their retirement, this also leads to less cognitive decline. So, it's certainly helpful if your work involved cognitive complexity. I mean, that kind of is a protective factor for later decline, but also for those that don't have that in their work, if they put it into their leisure time, that they do, and it's not just cognitive, but also cognitive and physical leisure activities. If they engage in those activities regularly, it helps to prevent it acts as a buffer, is what I want to say, to help prevent later cognitive declines. So you have to use your brain at some point, either in your work or in your leisure, if you want to stay sharp in your older years. Okay. The last section I'm going to look at is religion and adult lives. And we can define religion as an organized set of beliefs, practices, rituals, and symbols that increase an individual's connection to a sacred or transcendent other. We can also define the term religiousness. This is a term that's often used in research. The degree to which an individual is affiliated with an organized religion. So religiousness is in particular how closely you're associated with, once again, an organized religion. It's different than the term spirituality. You can be spiritual but not religious, So religiousness is specifically that you're following a prescribed religion. Okay. Anyways, when we look at some data, this is looking at the level of spirituality. Once again, spirituality is it does not have to involve an organized religion. In the study, they had individuals, all the way from their early 30s up through their late 60s and early 70s, rate themselves on their spirituality levels. And what we find is that there was a significant increase in spirituality that occurs between what they called late middle and late adulthood years. So in that last section, you can see for both men and women that the graphs are, trending upwards. Just to define some things in the study, early adulthood refers to the 30s in the study. Middle adulthood referred to the 40s. Late middle was the middle 50s and early 60s. And then the term late referred to the late 60s and early 70s. So this increase was happening somewhere between mid 50s and the early 70s, where people became more spiritual. The overall scale in the study, by the way, was a 5-point scale, ranging from 1 being the lowest level of spirituality to 5 being the highest. So these numbers are not particularly high. Just to put this graph in perspective, I mean, 1 was the actual lowest you could score in the study. So I don't even know why it goes down to 0, but so you can see the overall numbers were fairly low as far as the average rating of spirituality. And that would conclude chapter 13.